Welcome, everybody. It is Business Monday. Welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. It is the first Business Monday of 2019. We are sitting here with a man of tremendous insight, intelligence, and best of all, I just like the osmosis factor, wealth. He's the money man, Gary Sasse, former Director of Administration, former head of Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council, and the head of the Hassenfeld Institute at Bryant University. And played football somewhere down south, but we're not talking about it right now.
So how do you equate that background with wealth?
That I believe it was the payments you got as a recruit at Florida State that you invested it wisely started your success in life.
I'm not going there.
Welcome to the new year.
You too. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Lots going on. And let's talk. Let's talk a little prediction. Where are we in the new year? Lots of things going on. What direction is the state of Rhode Island headed in?
That's a very good question. And normally I would feel very comfortable to predict things, but I think the real problem is the state is pretty moribund right now. All the usual ideas are coming forward. So the speaker is going to continue to phase out of the car tax. The progressives, which I give a lot of credit to for getting organized and electing people, have their agenda from abortion rights to gun safety legislation, predictable. There's the usual budget problem, hasn't changed very much. It's a little worse in some years, a little better in others. This year's a pretty average year. They have to close $160 to $200 million problem over the 2 fiscal years.
Yeah.
Their only wild card that came up that makes things at least a little bit interesting is education. The RICAS scores, which everyone has commented on, have been dismal. Dismal.
Yeah.
Compared to Massachusetts.
Yeah. Just horrific.
And it didn't have anything to do with whether you were a poor district or a rich district. When compared to peers in Massachusetts.
No, more than half the school systems in Rhode Island finish below Fall River, Massachusetts.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't, however you want to measure it, it doesn't get any worse than that.
And if we were one school district, we would be in the bottom 10% of Massachusetts school districts.
Correct.
So that was a wake-up call.
And let me add one other factor. There's no more excuses, right, when you compare to Massachusetts. It's not like they don't have big towns and little towns. They have regional schools just like we do. They have poor cities and wealthy suburbs. There's really they're bigger, but they have the same construct from a governmental standpoint as we do.
And no, that's right. And some of the comparisons were between districts in the same socioeconomic class. So and East Greenwich was compared to towns in Massachusetts that had the same profile as East Greenwich. Central Falls was compared to towns and cities in Massachusetts that had the same, profile. And so when you adjust for profiles, we were dismal. We were bad. And so there has been demand for action. The Rhode Island Foundation has assembled a group that 10 years from now will implement a strategic plan. There's been talk about curriculum reform, doing it the way Massachusetts does it. There's been talk again about high-stakes testing, and we ran out a commissioner of education who I was involved with, who I thought was on the right course.
Right.
But because the legislature didn't have the political will to follow through, she's now in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Right.
The funding formula is a mess, and the funding formula is not just a mess for the disadvantaged districts. It's a mess for the rich districts too. When a district is getting 7-8% reimbursement, and given even the wealth of a district, the population they have, that's not really saying education is a state-local shared responsibility. I can remember when I first started out in this business, the state of Rhode Island guaranteed that every district would get at least 30% reimbursement.
Absolutely.
Well, that disequalized. That was high, and that took money away from districts that had greater need. But 7% is crazy. So the funding formula is a problem. It's in its 7th year. It's been fully implemented. There's supposed to have been a study to evaluate what it's done. I haven't seen that study yet. I don't know if I will live to see it, but it's not there. And so the interesting thing about education, there is going to be education reform legislation. You know, whether it's going to be substantive and meaningful, or whether it's going to be window dressing, you know, we don't know. Everyone talks about curriculum development. And we need, I mean, statewide curriculum, excuse me. And we need statewide curriculum for language arts and for reading, probably for the sciences. It's expensive. You have to train the...
But let's just talk about expense. On a per pupil spending level, Massachusetts is eighth in the country. We're ninth in the country. It does not appear to be that this is a money issue per se.
Well, when I say it's not a money issue, it's not a money issue, but there also are issues of resources. Massachusetts spent billions of dollars to put in place its system starting in 1991. So to think that we could emulate Massachusetts, even though we're ninth spending and they're eighth spending, without additional investments, naive. If you're going to put a statewide curriculum in place, you got to train people.
Right.
You got to buy materials. What good is it to have a statewide curriculum on STEM if you know districts don't have the physical equipment to implement that curriculum? Putting in place a statewide curriculum is expensive. Revising the funding formula when you don't want to revise it in a way to take money from anybody is expensive. And so it's totally naive to think because we're ninth highest spending now that reforms are going to be absorbed within that amount. That's not going to happen.
So let's go to this for 1 second. I think there's been some level of outrage over the dismal results of the RICAS scores versus the performance of the MCAS scores. And I think by any statistical evaluation, it's an embarrassment to the state, and it shows a massive underperformance, and it shows that our children are disadvantaged in comparison of achievement relative to the tests. And you've seen some flurry, you've seen more discussion at the statewide level by the two legislative leaders than the governor. The governor included it in her inaugural address, but it was not the number one thing we need to do was not reform education, it was we need to stay the course economically. Is she passionate enough, and as you said before, both in an opinion piece that ran in GoLocal and here on GoLocal Live on Business Monday, is she embedded enough, is she engaged enough to be a driving force in reforming education in her 4 years remaining as governor?
Well, compared to other governors, the answer is no. And let me give me a second to explain what I mean. I also wrote an op-ed piece for your competitor. And in that op-ed, which
we have no competitor.
Yeah.
You mean the old guys that shoot ink at dead trees?
If you're a competitor. And in that op-ed, you know, I said that education reform did not happen in a meaningful way unless the governor was leading the charge. And I went back and I looked at what different governors had done going back 30 years. And you had Jim Hunt in North Carolina, education reform governor. Lamar Alexander, who I work with in Tennessee, education reform governor. Bill Weld, Tom Kaine in New Jersey, Patton in Kentucky. So it wasn't defined by party, and it wasn't defined by region.
No, it was passion.
It was legacy, and these governors felt that their legacy was better education. And so while the governor has proposed education improvement programs, you don't get the feeling that that's what the legacy is about. And that's the passion question. Education reform happens when you get leadership from the front office. And that leadership sparks activity at the local level, it sparks activity at RIDE. You know, we work around the state and there are rumors about whether the existing
Wagner
will stay or whether it'll be a replacement.
Certainly the rumors are that he will not be here long, but who knows?
But the point being is we're in the middle of an education, I don't know, a crisis, I say.
If this isn't a crisis, what would define a crisis? Well, all the schools melting through a laser beam?
Well, climate change is in the mind of some of those people up there. So we have a performance crisis in many of our schools. We have uncertainty about the leadership at the Rhode Island Department of Education. We have the governor proposing education programs which really don't connect the dots, and that's the question. So we have Promise Rhode Island, and each one of those programs by itself meets the need. So it's not, I'm not here to say
So let's break this down. You know, the impetus for this conversation was predictions for the year. We heard or read the governor's inaugural address. Clearly, she identified a number of issues that were priorities. The number one was staying the course on economic development. I think that was clearly the number one articulated issue. Education was one of a number of other issues. Will we this time see enough force come together, enough motivation, enough consensus that we will see the beginning of that process here in Rhode Island in 2019 that started in Massachusetts in 1991 under Bulger and Weld and those folks?
Well, what we will see is a reaction. We'll see legislation on education. What I'm not quite sure we'll see is whether it'll be as meaningful as we hoped it would be. And that's, I don't know, I can't prejudge that. I do know that we have to deal with curriculum, we have to deal with high stakes testing, we have to deal with funding.
We haven't talked about the 800-pound gorilla, which is the teachers union. Teachers unions have been, in this state, one of the most powerful political forces in the state house, in elections, over the past 50 years. There's no reason to believe that their influence will diminish greatly. Are they on board? There's been very little narrative from them.
Well, see, I take exception to this extent.
They're not powerful?
They're very powerful.
Okay.
But they're also very powerful in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And they're very powerful in New Jersey. And they're very powerful in a number of other states where the governor has taken on education as their legacy. So to say that...
Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee's zooming by.
Okay. So to say that, you know, the unions are holding us back, the unions have been, you know, a problem in moving the ball in some cases, but it's an excuse because the same unions, the same strong unions exist in other states, and they have had the political leadership and the political will to break through. I think you can work with the unions. I think you have to, you know, push and be a tough negotiator, but that's just simply not an excuse. The excuse is that we've not had the leadership. The excuse is, it's ironic that we talk about reforming schools. It's ironic to say we can reform schools without investing more money. We can't. And at the same time, we have leadership in the state saying, let's cut taxes. Well, I love to cut taxes. You love to cut taxes. You know, no one's against tax cut. But how can you talk about getting rid of the estate tax? How can you talk about giving more relief to retirees, to keep retirees here when you need these huge problems in schools? And that's what leadership's about. Leadership's about saying that, boy, I'd love to cut more taxes, but schools come first. And when I look at what I have to invest in curriculum, what I have to invest in high-stakes testing, what I have to do to fix up the formula, we've made progress on tax cuts. Let me give you...
Go ahead.
No. The example is this. We had a policy objective to get out of the bottom 10 terrible states in the Tax Foundation's business tax climate ranking. We have. Right. We went from 50th 10 years ago to 37th today. I will tell you, it really doesn't matter if you're 37th or 35th or 29th. It matters if you're 40th, 41st, or 50th. So we're not going to get that bad story. We've cut the income tax. We've cut the business corporation tax, lowest rate in New England. We've made progress in cutting unemployment insurance costs. We've done a whole series. The speaker is taking the leadership to phase out the car tax. We've made a whole bunch of reforms. And what leadership says, those are important reforms. No one wants to go backward. No one wants to take them away. But we got to stop right now because our biggest priority, our highest priority, needs to be this generation and the future generations of kids. And we need to invest in making our schools better. That's the kind of leadership that changed the state and changed education policy, which is not here right now.
Final word on this subject, on analyzing what will happen in 2019. Will we see meaningful change, in your opinion, in 2019, in this legislative session?
I honestly, I'm going to duck because I don't know. I think we'll see change, and you need to see the devil's in the details to see if that change is meaningful. I think you'll get reform on curriculum. I think you'll get reform on evaluation. Is it meaningful? I don't know.
Let's jump to some of the other issues. We've talked about some budget challenges. We've talked about education. Will we see anything dramatic and new?
Well, we have the same dilemma we have had here for decades. If you want to do things dramatic and new, you have to have a very strong economy and a strong budget. We have an economy that's stronger than it has been, not as strong as the rest of the country.
Yeah.
We have an economy like the rest of the country and the world with great uncertainty. The president's tariffs are not helping, increasing debt's not helping. So if you look at what's happening in China today and what's happening in Europe, there's some uncertainties with the economy. So, and then on top of that, we have a budget problem. Now, the budget problem as a percentage of spending is really not that great. It's, I think it's about $40 million this year. It's about $120 million next year. On a $4 billion general fund budget, that's a very small percentage. But again, if you don't have the political will to make cuts, you sit around and you chase your tail.
Yeah.
And as you can chase your tail doing budgeting, your energy is eaten up and nothing really new and dramatic happens. So I'd like a lot to answer your question. Depends upon with how much realism face the budget problem.
You're seeing a status quo kind of year. Deal with the budget, make some steps on education.
Oh,
but
I think
nothing.
education maybe could be more than status quo. But where you get to issues that may not be status quo, or issues that are important to a lot of people, but they're not necessarily issues that are going to drive the future of the state. So we may see some social changes. We may see abortion rights enshrined.
Enshrine of Roe v. Wade.
Enshrine of Roe v. Wade.
Let's talk about Friday's jobs numbers, because we've been at the federal level this painfully long period, 6 weeks, of economic upheaval, some of it caused by a wildly fluctuating stock market, as you mentioned, trade issues with China, some uncertainty in other key regions of the world, South America, Europe, China. And then along comes Friday, and it's 314,000 new jobs. Ching ching, not to steal your sound effect, but a big new job number, and outperformed the estimates by nearly 100%.
And more than that, there was real growth in wages of over 3%.
Right.
For the 8 years of the Obama administration, there was a stagnant increase in wages, no more than 2%. So, you ask the reason why, and the answers are always mixed. Whether the people at State House on Smith Street like to admit it, the change in the regulatory regimes in this government have made a big difference. The tax cuts, we may be petering out, but the tax cuts, particularly on the business side, have had a big impact. So some of the more conservative economic policies I think have influenced the job growth. And the question is, how long does this continue?
Well, you're functionally, you're in the mid-threes on unemployment.
We're full employment.
You're functionally at zero on unemployment between people just changing jobs. Maybe you'll get some more people returning to the workforce, but for the most part, you can't really get below 3.
But there's also a qualitative question about the jobs, where the jobs are being created, what the jobs are paying, and that's the big problem in Rhode Island. While we've had job growth, we're still in the middle of the pack in terms of unemployment, which we shouldn't look to gift horse in the face, because we were not in the middle in terms of unemployment 5 or 6 years ago.
It was interesting. We looked at the governor's inaugural address from 4 years ago, and where she promised emphasis manufacturing, which there seemed to be a narrative that we were growing manufacturing over the last 4 years, actually shrunk. The areas that we saw job growth were in tourism-related and healthcare. Despite some closures and some significant layoffs by Care New England, there was absorption, and that was a leading area of growth in the marketplace. None of us know what the impact of, if Partners does acquire Care New England, what kind of impact that may have in the longer term.
No, I think, and that reflects the graying of the population
Yeah.
and the need for additional health care services. But look at what our jobs are paying. Manufacturing jobs in the 2 years of the Trump administration have probably gone up, and I stand to be corrected on this, but they've probably gone up about 400,000, 450,000. During the 8 years of the Obama administration, manufacturing jobs grew by 200, grew by half that amount in the 8 years versus the 2 years. So the fiscal policies have had some impact. Now you come back to Rhode Island and say, well, manufacturing employment's been flat.
Decrease in the last 4 years.
It's decreased the last 4 years, been flat the last two. There has been growth in service sector, and tourism and health, but look at the kind and quality of jobs that we're creating. And the wages are not keeping up with wage growth and other jobs being created elsewhere. And it gets back to the question that we started this conversation with. That's why it's so important. If the governor says she's going to stay the course and keep up the economic momentum, and this is where I disagree with the people that think real estate development is economic development.
Yeah.
Real estate development is good. It's real estate development, it's not
Right.
economic development. Economic development does a lot more with skills, workforce, and education. We have made progress in some of the worker training programs and the relationship with industry, but we've not made progress in the feeder system, in our education system. And that's why if she really wants, it's not good enough to say, I want to keep the momentum up on economic development. No, the next step is committing your political capital and your political future to fixing up the education system. That's an integral part of economic development. And no one's arguing that take resources away from what Commerce Rhode Island's doing and some of the loans and real estate development type programs. But we need, if we're going to keep the momentum up, we need more leadership on education.
Stay in Washington for a second. Big job numbers. We also have this mini governmental shutdown, about 800,000 federal workers impacted. As you remember, under the Sunland administration, every other Friday, we closed government for a year. Was it a year?
It was a while,
Yeah, about a year.
But we ended up, but we had a negotiation with labor before we went into it.
Right.
That those wages, would be paid back when they were
Either as
vacation
or towards the pension. There was a number of ways for it to be.
That's not even comparable because.
But just stay on that. One thing that was amazing during that period of time was no one seemed to care. Does anyone really care about the federal shutdown right now? I mean, I understand that there's some impact on the national parks and they need to be cleaned up and a couple other things, but
well, it builds over time. No, if this type of partial shutdown, lasted 7 days, no one would give a damn. It wouldn't make much of a difference. But you think about some of the areas where the partial shutdown will begin to affect us. I'll give you some examples. The FDA is going to run out of money in a month.
Yeah.
More and more TSA agents are calling out sick or they're blue outs. They're going to be fatigued. There are things that Homeland Security is not doing right now to trace cyber terrorism, which we don't know what that will mean. However you make up that time. So there are consequences, and the consequences are more than the human consequences.
Is anyone winning this battle?
Yeah, I think so.
You do?
I think the president's losing this battle. I think the president appears to be recalcitrant.
Is that a northeastern opinion? Do you think people in Montana think the president's losing?
I do, because I think if you look at national polling on the wall, no one's, people are not against the wall. Because if you told somebody you need a wall in Tijuana, San Diego, if you told people you needed a wall of Laredo, those crossing areas, they would agree. You need walls where there are lots of people, coming through at checkpoints. As a Republican, do you need a wall, eminent domain, in the middle of the Rio Grande Valley?
Right.
And I think the administration's done a very poor job in explaining, how this fits into border security. You need some physical barriers. You need around, urban concentrations where you're managing a lot of people. You don't need a wall in the middle of nowhere. There's technology that can help. And the president, the way he's carried on about this, sitting in the White House a few weeks ago with the new speaker and the minority leader of the Senate, saying, this is on me. I'm proud.
Right.
I'm proud of this. Well, somebody didn't teach him politics 101 because you always want the other side to get credit for the for the shutdown. And then first it's a wall, now it's a fence. First it's concrete, now it's steel. And what I think people are beginning to realize, and this is maybe a little bit too wonky. Okay, we need border security. Part of the border security is a physical barrier, whether it's a steel wall or a concrete wall, whatever it needs to be. But what's the strategic plan?
Right.
How many miles of wall? Is a wall an urban intervention? Is a wall an intervention at certain crossing points? No one has taken a map and drawn a map from the Pacific Ocean, through to Houston, and basically said, this is what this border is going to look like.
On Inauguration Day, Kate Nagel caught up with, our news editor caught up with a number of people up at the State House. One of them was David Cicilline, who said, listen, this shutdown isn't about a wall or anything else. It's about changing the narrative after a number of legal issues came forward that were either embarrassing or potentially putting the president in some significant legal exposure. Do you share that cynicism?
No, I'll tell you why I don't share it. In some ways it's political, but it's a matter of political survival for the president. Because remember George Bush saying, read my lips, no more taxes?
Right.
Okay. Well, this president campaigned all over the country. I'm going to build a wall.
Right.
Mexico can pay for it. Now we're not Mexico's not exactly going to pay for it, but I'm going to build a wall. So if he loses out completely on this, it's a real political loss. It's a sign of political weakness. To that extent, it's political. What I really take exception with are the kind of statements that were made by the speaker where it's a moral issue. It's not a moral issue. You and I may have different policies about a wall and what the right mix of investing in border security is, but your morals and my morals are not any better or any worse because we have a different strategy. So the Democrats trying to escalate this into a moral issue because of incidents at the border, I think is ill-founded. I think it's a political issue because the president will be seen as not being able to deliver on something he made quite a fuss about.
How does this get resolved?
I don't know. The president's going on television tomorrow night.
Yeah.
And we'll find out. I don't know. And you talk about the impact of the shutdown. First of all, there's a human impact, and it's one thing to say, well, it doesn't have much of an impact, but if some TSA worker or some clerk at DHS doesn't get paid for 6 months, that's a human tragedy.
Yeah.
And we all supposed to be protecting our each other national security. So
and for the most part, the folks that are most directly impacted by this shutdown are middle income wage federal workers and lower income wage federal workers.
And we didn't talk about the contract workers
Yeah.
who will never get their money back.
Get their money back.
And that's I don't know what the number is. I've heard numbers as much as 500,000 contract workers. I don't know what the numbers. So yeah, but when you walk to an airport and you miss your plane because there's a TSA lockout, stick out, or the TA agency's morale is low, so they take a little longer to go through your check you out. That has an impact. It's not garbage piling up in the national parks.
Sure.
But it's what we're not doing at DHS. It's not it's the security that's compromised at airports. It's a whole number of things. And there is a human cost. 800,000 people not getting paid for 6 months. It shows a kind of a meanness, a kind of an arrogance, a cavalier attitude. So I think, hopefully it'll get resolved. Hopefully there'll be face saving on both. The best deal would be both sides say face, and we'll see if that happens.
Lastly, what's new at Hassenfeld? You've got some...
Hassenfeld is doing well.
Yeah.
We were looking at some performance numbers, and Hassenfeld's about 9 years old now. And over the 9 years, we've had 10,000 participants in our programs. We've had about 114 programs. This last weekend, in cooperation with the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns and the Rhode Island Association of School Committees, we had the 5th training program for newly elected officials. Every 2 years after a general election, we bring in newly elected officials. There are about 150 at the over the weekend, with us, and they discussed everything from ethics and conflict of interest to mapping out strategies to get things done, to collective bargaining. And so I think it was a productive program, and we're continuing to grow.
Is there any difference you see in 9 years between the types of folks who are getting elected to public office than a decade ago?
Yeah, well, I think so. I looked out at the face of the crowd this time, and it seems to be more diversity.
Yeah.
I think so. That the same quality of people, but I think there's a more diverse group this time.
More women, a lot more Latinos.
Latinos, women,
Yeah.
African Americans. Yeah, it was a more diverse group.
Younger, older, the same?
We didn't check birth certificates at the door, but I would think a little younger. Well, maybe they're just in better shape.
Yeah. As always, I want to thank you for coming on. Some good insights into how to reform education in Rhode Island. Appreciate you coming on the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We're excited about 2019. This week we do some rollouts. We've rolled out some of the 19 to watch in 2019. We did half today. We do the other half tomorrow. I think it's exciting times. It's an interesting time for Rhode Island. And I do think probably the most positive part of the governor's speech, the most insightful, it's something Saul Kaplan talks about all the time, is we are the right size petri dish to be able to experiment and try new things. And when we all come together, we can do things and do them quickly, do them efficiently, and explore those transitions and potential improvements. So it'll be interesting to see if this is just a caretaker kind of year in dealing with the budget, or we move forward with a little more aggressive. The economy is pretty good. Most people are employed. Is an opportunity to take advantage of some changes.
I work for a governor, and he said, "You guys," this is our staff, he said, "You guys have all the creative ideas in the world. Now I need some creative ideas on how to raise money to pay for this."
Yeah,
that's
right.
the problem.
With that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Be back tomorrow, Kate and Nagel. We're going to be live almost all day tomorrow. There's a hearing up at the Ethics Commission on Ms. Markey's looking for an advisory opinion. NEA official who's been elected to the South Kingstown School Committee. There's a big announcement at TF Green Airport. Then we'll have the afternoon show. It was busy all weekend with the inaugural events. Stay tuned all week long.